Welcome. My name is Stephen Lyon. I am the Professor of Anthropology and Head of Educational Programs at Aga Khan University's Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilization. It is my immense pleasure and privilege to be able to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Professor Kwame Anthony Appiah. This lecture series is jointly hosted by the Aga Khan University, by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, the Aga Khan Music Initiative, and Aga Khan Museum. These four Aga Khan Development Network organizations, we came together this year to host a series of talks that sort of loosely worked around the issues of pluralism. That's the theme for the year. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker tonight. Professor Appiah is an award-winning author. He's a philosopher, a cultural theorist, and novelist. His interests include political and moral theory, the philosophy of language and mind, and African intellectual history. Professor Appiah is professor of philosophy and law at New York University. He writes the ethicist column for the New York Times. Some of you may know his 2016 Wreath Lecture Series for the BBC Radio. These are one of the sort of highest prestige indicators you can get as an academic. To deliver the Wreath Lecture Series, I think is something on all of our to-do lists or our bucket lists. He's written a number of books. There are two books that I want to specially mention tonight because I think one speaks directly to the heart of this lecture series, and the other, although it was written almost 30 years ago, couldn't be more timely. Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers, published in 2007, really does address what we're trying to get not only in this lecture series, but in the Aga Khan Development Network. It's been described as a moral manifesto for living together on a planet with, at the time in 2007, more than 6 billion people, but as we speak in 2020, more than 7 billion people. I think this is an important book, and it's one that's worth rereading. The second book that I want to mention tonight is his 1993 book, In My Father's House, Africa in the Philosophy of Culture, from 1993. It addresses many of the tensions that came to dominate the news cycle in 1993 following the beating of Rodney King. Today, tragically, almost 30 years later, we find ourselves again reflecting on the foundations of racism, discrimination, fear, violence, and of course, identity. It is my pleasure and privilege to hand over to Professor Appiah, who will deliver this evening's AKU, AKTC, AKM, AKMI joint lecture series for 2019-2020 entitled, Who Am I? What Are We? Identity and Global Citizenship. Now, Professor Appiah will speak at the end of his talk. There will be an opportunity for the audience members to ask questions. If you could do this in the chat, in the question section, write your questions out. I will read those out to him at the end. If you have technical issues, then go ahead and write that in the chat section, and our technical support team will address those immediately. So Professor Appiah, it is my great pleasure to hand it over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for that kind introduction. And I'm hoping you can now see my, my first slide, which is just the title slide. So let me begin. So I come from two families in two places pretty far apart. My mother grew up on a farm in a tiny, absurdly picturesque village on the border of Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. And this is what that village looks like. And it really is absurdly picturesque. In the 1950s, my mother found a job in London in an organization working for racial harmony in Britain and her then empire. The organization was called Racial Unity, and that was how she met my father, who was a law student from the Gold Coast. He was an anti-colonial activist. He was the president of the West African Students' Union, and he was a representative in Britain of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who was to lead Ghana to independence in 1957, just a few years after I was born. So my mother practiced what she preached. On the other side, then, my family came from Ghana, from Kumasi, in the heart of the modern Republic of Ghana, which is the city where my father was born. His lineage could be traced back to an early 18th century general, a successful member of the military aristocracy that created the Asante Empire. And his name, Akramampim, is one of the names that my parents gave me. I realize this is an early 19th century picture, but I can't find an early 18th century picture of Asante. Each person's sense of self is bound to be shaped by their family background, as mine has been. But there are also larger identities that are clearly important: gender, creed, country, color, class, and culture. So my first question is, why do they matter? And also, what on earth do they have in common? I began my own explorations many years ago, thinking about race. And when I turned to thinking about nationality and class and religion and gender as sources of identity and added in sexual orientation, I found three ways that these very disparate forms of grouping people do, in fact, have something important in common. The first is obvious. They come with labels. Every identity comes with labels. So understanding identities requires first that you have some idea about how to apply them. That way you can look for someone of that identity or try to decide of someone that you've met whether the label applies to them. And people can disagree about the boundaries here. I found an article some years ago by a man called Mustafa Tabal, a Dane of Kurdish ancestry, in the Danish newspaper, which was titled, Danishness has become a national religion that one cannot convert to. So for some Danes, it seems as though a Muslim can't be Danish, but obviously for most civilized Danes, that's not true. But these kinds of disputes about the boundaries have to be consistent, of course, with there being some consensus about central cases. If we couldn't agree on about anybody being Danish, we couldn't have a concept of a Danish identity. A second point is that membership in an identity group helps to shape its members' emotions and their deeds. It creates what I sometimes call norms of identification, rules about how you should behave given what your identity is. And one of the common ways in which it matters is that we feel some sort of solidarity with other members of our group. Our common identity gives us reason, we think, to care about and to help one another. But just as there's usually contest or conflict about the boundaries of groups, about who's in and who's out, there's almost always disagreement about what normative significance an identity has. What does being Danish or British or Ghanaian require of you? And I doubt that we could generate an easy consensus in any of those cases about that. There's a third feature all identities share, which is that they not only give you reason to do things, they give people reasons to do things to you. I've already mentioned something that identity can make people do to you. They can help you just because you share an identity with them. That's solidarity. But among the most significant things people do with identities is use them as the basis of hierarchies of status and respect and of structures of power. In many places in the world, for example, one ethnic or racial group regards its members as superior to others and assumes the right to better treatment. And as was said in the introduction, that's too evident, I'm afraid, in the country that I live in today. So to summarize all this in 3 sentences, identities come with labels and ideas about why and to whom they should be applied. Your identity shapes your thoughts about how you should behave and affects the way other people treat you. And finally, all these identities elements, all these dimensions are contestable. They're up for dispute. Who's in, what they're like, how they should behave, and how they should be treated. So in America, where I live, when we talk about our quasi-tribal cleavages today, the first ones we think about are obviously those to do with race. But identity functions too, when it comes to an intersecting issue, those cleavages of class and our growing problem of class segregation in the United States. For the past couple of generations, we've been told that the solution to a caste-like system of class hierarchy was what, back in the 1950s, the British sociologist Michael Young dubbed meritocracy. But there's now reason to hope that the cure has turned into the disease, which, by the way, is exactly what Michael Young prophesied. Meritocrats, enlisting all the resources at their disposal, now breed more meritocrats. And to the extent that you can predict that disproportionately many of the children of the elite will, and disproportionately many of the children of the precariat won't, achieve a position in the top tier of wealth, power, and privilege, you have something too much like the intergenerational transmission of status that does mark a system of caste. That rich societies need to have a word for precarity for having an income so insecure that it damages your mental or physical well-being is surely itself a scandal. And this is not just, of course, an American problem, it's a problem in Britain where you are as well. And Michael Young lived to see his prophecies come true. Writing at the start of the new millennium, he lamented that educational institutions had been enlisted into a newly calcifying form of social stratification. With an amazing battery of certificates and degrees at its disposal, he observed, education has put its seal of approval on a minority and its seal of disapproval on the many who fail to shine from the time they are relegated to the bottom streams at the age of 7 or before. So what should have been mechanisms of mobility became fortresses of privilege. Well, if this new dynastic system was taking shape, you might suppose that meritocracy has faltered because we aren't meritocratic enough. You could seek to push more rigorously for merit, making sure that every child has the educational advantages and is taught the social tricks that successful families now hoard for their children. So isn't that the right response? Well, not according to Michael Young. He saw that there would be a problem even if the top class didn't exploit its advantages to give their children chances that were denied to others. A system of class filtered by meritocracy would, in the end, still be, in his view, a system of class. It would involve a hierarchy of social respect, granting dignity to those at the top, but denying respect and self-respect to those who didn't inherit the talents and the capacity for effort that, combined with proper education, would give them access to the most highly remunerated and respected occupations. Class identities in a meritocracy reduce people to a single measure of worth, Michael Young worried, and only someone with a very limited moral vision could suppose that human worth reduces to a single measure. Each of us, after all, comes equipped with different talents and is born into different circumstances. And because people choose their own projects, each of us faces his or her own challenge, one that is, in the end, unique. So there is no sensible answer to the question of whether one person meets her challenge better than another. Did Virginia Woolf have a better life than Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart? The only sane answer is that Woolf was a better novelist and Mozart a better musician. I know what it is for my life to go better or worse, but it doesn't make sense to ask whether my life is better than yours. Indeed, because each of us does face a distinct challenge, what matters in the end is not how we rank against others at all. We don't need to find something we are the best at. What is important is simply that we do our best. The ideology and the mechanisms of meritocracy have led us to conflate two different concerns. One is a matter of efficiency. The other is the question of human worth. If you want people to do difficult jobs that require talent, education, effort, training, and practice, we're going to need to be able to identify and incentivize candidates with the right combination of aptitude, appetite, and application. So we'll design schools and universities and select people to fill the places in them. If the institutions are working properly, they aren't merely handing out credentials, which is always a danger. They're building what you might call human capital. We then allow for entrepreneurship, social and commercial, and we offer jobs with salaries and other advantages, interesting work, respect and autonomy in your job, vacations, pensions, healthcare, and we select people to fill those as well. If the principles of selection have been reasonably designed, we can say, if we like, that the people who meet the criteria for entering the schools or universities or getting the jobs merit those positions. That is, to enlist some useful philosopher's jargon, a matter of institutional desert. People deserve these positions in the sense in which people who buy winning lottery tickets deserve their winnings. They got them by a proper application of the rules. But institutional desert has nothing to do with the intrinsic worth of the people who get those college places or who get those jobs, any more than lottery winners are people of special merit and losers are somehow less worthy. Even if we're going to reward hard work, the capacity for hard work is itself the result of natural endowments and upbringing. So neither talent nor effort, the two things that determine rewards in the world of the meritocracy, is itself something earned. The lives of the less successful are not less worthy then, but not because they are as worthy or more worthy. There's simply no sensible way of comparing the worth of human lives that makes sense of those judgments. So here, I think, is a better way of thinking about it. Money and status are social rewards that can encourage people to do the things that need doing. It's a matter of luck whether you inherit the capacities whose development will be rewarded in the society into which you're born, and of more luck whether the capacities you actually develop turn out to be highly rewarded. You can respond to messages from the market and seek training, of course, and a well-designed society will elicit and deploy developed talent efficiently. But none of that makes it acceptable to have class identities that belie the basic moral equality of all human beings. Now, of course, we want the best for our kids, but we shouldn't secure our children's advantages in a way that denies a decent life to the children of others. Each child should have access to a decent education, suitable to her talents and her choices as they both develop. Each should be able to regard him or herself with self-respect. Historically, we've used inheritance taxes to help even out opportunities here. Further democratizing the opportunities for advancement is something we know how to do, even if the state of current politics in Britain and the United States has made it increasingly unlikely that it will be done. But we also need to work to do something that I think we don't quite know how to do yet, which is to eradicate contempt for those who are disfavored by the meritocrat's ethic of effortful competition. My goal isn't to eradicate hierarchy and to turn every mountain into a salt flat. We live rather in a plenitude of incommensurable hierarchies, and the circulation of social esteem will always advantage the better novelist, the more important mathematician, the savvier businessman, the faster runner, the more effective social entrepreneur. So we can't fully control the distribution of economic, social, and human capital, or eradicate the intricate patterns that emerge from all these overlaid grids. But we don't have to continue to produce the injuries of class. We face the urgent collective task of revising the ways we think about human worth to avoid compounding material inequalities with needless hierarchies of status. But class isn't the only identity that produces division, of course. At the turn of the 1950s, my father campaigned in Britain for Ghanaian independence, as I said, representing Kwame Nkrumah, who was to be our first president. That's him, the first president with my parents. My father was elected to our first parliament in Ghana in the late 1950s. My grandfather had been, in effect, the prime minister of the Asante king, and like his father, my dad had a strong sense of identity as an Asante. But one of the great themes of my father's life as a politician over the next 30 years was the importance of resisting what he called tribalism. In Ghanaian English, we call our many ethnic groups tribes, and most Ghanaians will happily tell you their tribe. Ghana has 23 languages that are spoken by more than 50,000 people. There are 80 or so languages altogether, some spoken by more than one tribe. So depending on how you count, we have at least 100 tribes. Some of their names are on this map. One thing you could mean by the word tribalism is being overinvested in these older political identities, older that is than Ghana, and not giving proper weight to the modern national identity as a result. My father thought that when you were acting as a national politician in the Ghanaian parliament, say, you shouldn't seek unfair advantage for your tribe over the others, and you should never fail to give proper weight to the concerns of tribes other than your own. Now, this was an ideal that Ghanaian politics has never fully lived up to, but it's important as an ideal, nevertheless. Political cultures are defined by ideals like these, even when we don't live up to them. The state is not meant to have a tribal identity. That's the ideal that anti-tribalism stands for. Ghana is meant not to be Asante or Ewe or Ga, in the sort of way that most of us believe that Britain is not meant to be white. I grew up then thinking that tribalism was bad. That meant that being Ghanaian, identifying with the country, was good. We were Ghanaian patriots in our house. But I also grew up thinking that I was Asante, and that the fate of Asante, embodied in my uncle and great uncle, kings of Asante, was important for me, for my family, and for all other Asante people. We took pride in our heritage. We, for example, invented kente cloth. That's what Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States, was wearing this week in honor of George Floyd. We Ghanaians, I think, take pride in the fact that kente has traveled around the world. We defeated the British a few times in warfare, we Asante. We support Asante Kotoko, our local soccer team. And it never occurred to me that rejecting tribalism meant rejecting my tribe. So how can we take advantage of our tribes without succumbing to the debilitating effects of tribalism? Well, as my father taught me, for the citizens of every nation, however divided, one of their identities is the national identity. And the theory of democracy is that we, the people, all of us, are charged with directing the ship of state together. Democracy isn't about majorities winning and minorities losing. It's to be a system in which each of us takes responsibility for contributing to the nation's collective welfare. The Democratic Compact requires us to secure for everyone, not just our own tribe, the rights enunciated in the Universal Declaration, freedoms of speech and religion and assembly, equal protection of the laws, regardless of race and gender and religion, and so on. So what can we do to stick to the compact while caring for our own tribes and their common projects? Well, social psychology teaches us that bigotry towards members of one's own community is something that can be both created and destroyed by the circumstances in which people live together. Long ago, the psychologist Gordon Allport argued for what's called the contact hypothesis. Roughly, he said that contact between individuals of different groups makes hostility and prejudice less likely if it occurs in a framework that meets a few important conditions. Crucially, it must be on terms of rough equality, and it must be in activities where shared goals are pursued in contexts of mutual dependency. This is one of the reasons why, for example, United States racially integrated armed services turn out to produce people who are less racist, on average, when they leave than when they arrive. There's a lot of data on that. It's this, I don't mean that they all leave without as non-racist, that's evidently not true, but they're less racist. It's this that makes segregation within a single society potentially so disastrous. Well, segregation makes it unlikely that children will meet and collaborate, acquiring the experience of mutual reliance on terms of rough equality. We can do something about this in principle within the nation by integrating our communities and our schools. And we Americans are used to thinking that we ought to do this to face the challenges of our racial divisions. And I feel a very strong sense this week that that conviction is particularly strong and growing in the whole population, not just among African Americans. But unfortunately, our political tribes are increasingly segregated too. So we need to find more spaces where people of our dominant political tribes build the social trust that allows tribes to cohabit, while continuing to disagree about important matters. We need to be in conversation with one another across all our differences. Here's a small fictional story that exemplifies what I mean. In the final episode of the first season of the British television series Skins, which is about a group of students in England, high school students, there's a scene at the birthday party of one of the characters, Anwar, an English teenager of South Asian ancestry, whose father is a devout Muslim. Anwar's best friend, Maxi, is gay, and he's been waiting for Anwar to tell his parents this, which Anwar has, perhaps unsurprisingly, been afraid to do. So Maxi is standing outside, refusing to come into the birthday party until Anwar finally tells his parents the truth. While they're talking, Anwar's father comes out and invites Maxi in, and his wife has made a spicy curry just for him. So let me just show you what happens. apologize, I just lost control of the system. Here we are. All right. So Mr. Corral, it seems to me, apologize, I dropped my text. So this is how things are, I think, with people who are in conversation with one another. Mr. Corral belongs to the Muslim tribe, and Maxi's tribe is Christian, or perhaps post-Christian. But they don't have to agree. They have only to accept each other. And they can do that without a theory or a principle, because being together, Maxi has grown up with Anwar, has generated commitments that can transcend even serious disagreement. This kind of cosmopolitan cohabitation is something that we all know how to do, but we're all only going to bother to do it if we're already in conversation with one another. And we need to figure out how to start the conversations, which means sharing our thoughts about the things we agree about and about the things we disagree about, big things and small things, soccer, television shows, movies, the gossip about other people at work. Mr. Corral begins in exactly the right place, with an admission that he can't work out everything. He doesn't know everything. The world is hard to understand. Maybe he's not right about everything. He doesn't abandon his belief that homosexuality is wrong. He lays it aside as something to work out later. Right now, what matters is celebrating his son's 17th birthday with his son's best friend. This works in practice. It doesn't need a theory. I'm a philosopher. I like theories. But theory isn't the only thing that matters. To accept the ways in which all politics is identity politics is to recognize that high-flown ideas, including a moral commitment to equality, need to come down to earth. So right now, we need to find ways in my society and in yours, I believe, in the post-Brexit context, to draw on our non-partisan identities, our non-political identities, as in my case, Americans, as citizens of political, but also as citizens of particular communities, members of churches and synagogues and mosques, to combat the tribalism that is undermining our democracy and yours. Because for better or worse, it is only through identities that ideas can change the world. Now, so identities can become forms of confinement then, but it's equally important that they can also give contours to our freedom as working class and gay and lesbian and national and religious identities have done in struggles all around the world. Women have worked together across class and language and religion and nation in the global struggle against oppression and inequality. Social identities connect the small scale where we live our everyday lives with larger movements, causes, and concerns. They can make a wider world intelligible, alive, and urgent. They expand our horizons to communities larger than the ones we personally inhabit. And we're denizens of an age in which our actions in the realm of ideology, as in the realm of technology, increasingly have global effects. So we're in desperate need, I think, today of a spirit of global citizenship. And since the Greek for citizen of the world is cosmopolites, and the ideal has been defended under that name for nearly 2.5 millennia, I will call it the spirit of cosmopolitanism. Now, I wrote a book in defense of cosmopolitanism a decade and a half ago, and frankly, I didn't anticipate that this ideal I found so attractive would come to be one of the great bogeymen of our age. Josh Hawley, a recently elected American senator from Missouri, declared in a keynote address to the inaugural National Conservatism Conference last summer in Washington, D.C., that, quote, the great divide of our time is between the cosmopolitan elite and everyone else. Guess whose side he was on? For years, the politics of both left and right, he said, have been informed by a political consensus that reflects the interests not of the American middle, but of a powerful upper class and their cosmopolitan priorities. This class, he explained, lives in the United States, but they identify as citizens of the world, and their primary loyalty is to the global community. They chase profits without concern for country, creating an economy that ultimately benefits those who have the money to start with, and they've left middle America with flat wages and lost jobs. Now, Mr. Hawley is on the right, but you could easily create a YouTube supercut of people saying similar things on the American left. In 2018, President Obama gave an address in honor of President Mandela, where he described a new business elite that was cosmopolitan in outlook and insulated to the pain it inflicted on particular people in particular communities. Senator Bernie Sanders, the American Senate's only self-avowed socialist, has for years railed against plutocrats whose avarice showed very little concern for our country. Senator Elizabeth Warren, in the second Democratic debate, said, "The giant multinational corporations crafting our trade policies have no patriotism. If they can save a nickel by moving a job to Mexico, they'll do it in a heartbeat." Nor do you have to be American, as you know, to decry a globalist menace. The Gilets jaunes, protesters in France, too, have taken aim at an internationalized class with its planetary concerns and airy indifference to hardship chez nous. The elites talk about the end of the world, they say, while we talk about the end of the month. Prime Minister Theresa May, at the British Conservative Party annual conference in 2016, said sternly, as perhaps you'll recall, "If you believe you are a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere." When you hear such rhetoric from left, right, and center, you can start to wonder whether cosmopolitanism really deserves its constituency. So what really counts as cosmopolitan? And this is important, I think, because if you poll people around the world, large numbers of people do identify as world citizens in many, many countries. So I want to ask what really counts as cosmopolitan, and to suggest that these remarks of these various political leaders of left and right misunderstand it. The terms dates, as I said, to ancient Greece, but it was turned into an influential practical philosophy by the Roman Stoics of the 1st and 2nd centuries. It shaped early Christianity. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, as St. Paul said famously. And it led Marcus Aurelius to see that because we have multiple identities, there's no clash between loyalty to Rome and loyalty to humanity. My city and my country, insofar as I'm Antoninus, he said, is Rome. Insofar as I'm a human being, it is the world. We could think that everybody everywhere matters and have special obligations to those who depend on our care and concern, and whose care and concern we depend on. As Cicero, an earlier cosmopolitan, said, human fellowship will be best served if we treat most kindly those to whom we are most closely connected. And in the spirit of cosmopolitanism, let me mention that similar ideas can be found in Confucian traditions as well, addressing humanity as Tiansha, all under heaven. As the contemporary Chinese philosopher Zhao Tingyang puts it, first, Tianjia means all under heaven. Second, it refers to the general will of all peoples in the world, entailing a universal agreement. It involves the heart more than the mind because the heart has feelings. And third, Tiansha is a universal system that's responsible for world order. Today, very many of us are closely connected to many people in other countries, or some people in other countries. Many of us were born in one country, make our livelihood in the second, and are married to someone from yet another. I should know, my sister's grandchildren have 20th century ancestors from England, Ghana, Namibia, Nigeria, Norway, and Russia. There we are, many of us. Almost any pair of people in this picture, take almost any pair, then the older one will either be a spouse, a sibling, a parent, a grandparent, or a cousin, or an in-law of the other. This is a family, modern family group with many citizenships and many origins. At the same time, many of the biggest threats we face are global: climate change, nuclear proliferation, pandemics, you name them. And they require global action. So if you want to protect the world, it helps to see yourself as a citizen of it. So it's important to say that what all that anti-cosmopolitan rhetoric misses. Nothing stops us from conceiving ourselves as citizens of our countries and of the wider world. My sense of American citizenship is perfectly consistent with the sense of belonging I have to my own town, yay, New York, and my state, also New York. Senator Hawley knows he can be a good Missourian and a good American. America is not going to become the rest of the world, Hawley said, and the rest of the world isn't going to become America. But that's not a point against cosmopolitanism. It's a precondition of it. Cosmopolitans value cross-cultural encounters. They would be pointless if everybody were to become the same. Being a cosmopolitan doesn't tell you in advance whether you should favor free trade or fair trade. These policy decisions involve an assessment of their likely consequences. But you're not being cosmopolitan if you're indifferent to suffering at home. Although globalization and labor mobility have been, in the aggregate, greatly beneficial to the United States as well as to the world, these forces have produced both winners and losers. And one could say the same thing about the United Kingdom. And political leaders should have directed some of the enormous winnings from globalization and labor mobility, and also from robotization, towards ensuring that those who lost out could find their footing. If our political leaders, left, right, and center, failed to do that, and I think they did, they were not being cosmopolitan, they were being uncosmopolitan. The fundamental cosmopolitan thought is that everybody matters. We live with, as you said at the start, over 7 billion fellow humans on a small warming planet. The cosmopolitan impulse that draws on our common humanity is no longer a luxury, it's become a necessity. And in encapsulating that ancient ideal, I want to end with the words of a freed slave from Roman Africa, a Latin interpreter of Greek comedies, a writer from classical Europe who called himself Appiah, the African. So here's how Publius Terentius Appiah, writing more than 2 millennia ago, put it. Homo sum humani nihil a me alienum puto. I am human. I think nothing human alien to me. No matter what your identity was, Terence was up for conversation with you. That is an attitude to identity, the fundamental cosmopolitan attitude that I believe I can commend to us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Appiah. I'm very sorry that we don't hear the applause on the other end of this, but I'm sure it's there. First, I'd like to thank you for an exceptionally thought-provoking and optimistic. I actually feel more hopeful as a consequence of this talk. There are a number of questions that are coming in, but before I yield the floor to the audience, I'd like to pick you up on this contact theory. Now, within anthropology, there are a number of people who've tried to understand those kind of persistent tensions that you see a community and you think, okay, they're fine, but then it erupts. And one of the more famous ones is a guy named Robert Hayden, a legal anthropologist who's written about religious sites in South Asia and in the Balkans. And he calls this antagonistic tolerance, where you can actually have even a degree of syncretism. You can have shared religious spaces. You can have sort of a passive non-interference between communities, so long as they're equal. And his argument is, as soon as there's one group that sees a little imbalance, they think, oh, we can actually get one over, then we will always have that tension. So it's a very pessimistic view he takes, that in fact there is no point at which the antagonism goes away. It's simply muted. It's simply dormant for a time. And I'm thinking about the requisite attributes that you mentioned: equal status, common goals, cooperation, institutional support. Well, in India, I'm not sure we had those, but in Yugoslavia, I think we did. And yet, even there, as soon as the equality dipped, it in fact fell apart. So I'm wondering, really, I want you to lift me up here and give me hope. Yeah. Is it possible, is Bob Hayden wrong with antagonistic tolerance, or is there a realistic prospect of the kind of contact hypothesis leading to this cosmopolitanism that you describe?
So I think it's important in Yugoslavia to stress the point you correctly made, which is that the problems in Yugoslavia began when the state support for this system of toleration disappeared, because the Yugoslav state, the post-communist state, sort of effectively disappeared, or the communist state disappeared. And second, in that context, there was a massive economic collapse. And in that economic collapse, people sought resources for competition for the diminishing cake. And they used different kinds of resources. Some people used religion, some people used ethnicity, Serb, Croat, Albanian. Some people used the distinction between the Eastern Orthodox Church and Catholic Church, and some, of course, used Islam, and so on. So I'm not saying that if you have that kind of social collapse, people won't. It's not that they were, as it were. I don't think that the right way to think about it is that, as it were, Serbs and Croats hated each other all along secretly. It's that when there's a moment of crisis, people reach for the identities that are available in order to organize solidarities to compete. So we need to, so a background state, a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious state, has to be very careful to do this thing that most states, of course, want to do anyway, which is to make sure there aren't these collapses, because they're bad for life in many ways. But also to make sure that if there is a belt to be tightened, it's tightened equally. That the state continues to treat people in that non-tribalistic way that my father identified, which is that you don't. The state is not on the side of one group or the other, and that means that if there's a burden to be shared, it has to be shared among the groups equally. Now. One of the things that happened in Yugoslavia with someone like Milosevic, that's happened in Hungary with the present leadership there, and so on, is that it's a very easy way to mobilize people, to mobilize ethnic or religious intolerance. And as it were, lazy leaders, or leaders who don't have anything else to offer because they're not competent to do anything positive and useful, reach for this, I think, because it works. So Hayden's right that it's always possible to take almost any distinction, even I mean, Rwanda's a good example here, because Hutus and Tutsis, I know that the Belgians thought they were different races, but if you actually just look around in Rwanda, it's awfully hard to tell who's who, and they speak the same language. And so on. They were all Catholics. But nevertheless, in Rwanda, which, as perhaps people know, is a society, a very, very dense population, and much of it living on the edge of subsistence. So it's an ecologically difficult context. So there is a cake that's not big enough, and there's serious competition for resources. In that sort of context, yes, I think people will reach for what's there. And the Belgians gave them Hutu and Tutsi, so they took it and used it. And the first genocidal conflicts in Rwanda happened in the 60s, not the one that was famous. They started then. But so it's very important for political leadership, and for people advising political leadership, and for those of us outside who are putting pressure on political leadership, to make sure to tell them that this is a weapon of politics that you should use. Well, in my view, you shouldn't use it, but if you do use it, you should recognize that it's enormously risky. And so, especially, I mean, it's risky both in the context of multi-racial societies, or multi-religious societies, or multi-ethnic societies. It's also very, very dangerous in international contexts, where mobilizing national chauvinism, that also is something that you can lose control of. It may be very useful to rile people up in that way, but if you start using, the Chinese government uses Chinese nationalism to organize a fight about some tiny islands that are not worth anything to anybody, they have no guarantee that once they've got the Chinese population excited about it, they can then turn it off. So I think one lesson for leaders is you need, in other words, the contact hypothesis makes it possible for people to have low levels of intolerance most of the time. Unfortunately, this other mechanism means that you can turn it back on with almost any identity that's sitting there.
Thank you.
And I think it's often a little bit contingent which identities get picked up. I think Yugoslavia is a good example of that.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have a number of questions here. I'd like to there's one here that I think a number of people must be thinking about because this is part of our lived reality. How do we address racist and objectionable attitudes within our communities, especially when espoused by our elders and leaders? And I think if we all remember Barack Obama's 2007 race speech, in which he talked about his own grandmother, this is something that's actually very difficult, I find. What are your thoughts on this?
I think a family is an important kind of context for these conversations because families are, generally speaking, in my technical sense, in conversation already. People in families are already talking to each other about big things and small things. They know a lot about each other. And also, I think, mostly, they have a background commitment to persisting in their relations with one another, even after they have rows and disagreements and so on. Whereas with a lot of relationships, a big row can just end them. It doesn't usually end your relationship with your grandson or your grandfather or your grandmother if you have a big row, and you know that, and so as well you're aware that all this is going on against the background of that of a kind of family solidarity. I in that context, because this is a family context, and because essentially this is families with people who, among other things, love one another, it is important, I think, to be kind of historical, to recognize that your grandparents grew up a long time before you in a different world, and that many of the things that they say that you wouldn't say, for example, are things that were said by people like them when they were young, and we've improved. Society's gotten better. We don't say some of those things anymore, but they grew up saying them, and they're not especially wicked. Usually, your grandparents, they're just inherited some of the bad habits, some of the bad moral habits that every society has, and that we have today. And our grandchildren will complain about us. I already have a great niece and two great nephews, but they're too young to complain about me. But they will soon, I am sure. So I think it's actually a particularly useful context in which to try to do this, because, as I say, in the end, it's unlikely to lead to a complete breakup, which it might in almost any other kind of relationship, including a relationship at work. But I think you need to be tolerant if you're criticizing people in your own family. You need to recognize, sort of, as it were, historicize and understand them. And in particular, I think to recognize that some of the things that are correctly understood now to be wrong, they simply didn't grow up thinking of as wrong. And that's how moral progress occurs, that what's a default bad habit in one generation is replaced by a default good habit in the next. And that's great. But we still have to live with these other generations. So I think you should let your grandparents or parents, or whoever it is, know what you think. And I think you should prepare yourself with good arguments. You should explain. You should be able to explain what's wrong, not just criticize them, but explain to them why people saying and doing and those things, or why the people that they think are behaving okay, behaving the way they do is in fact not very good. You need to be able to explain. You can't just you shouldn't just assume your own righteousness. You should defend it. So actually, I think a family is a place where something that's quite rare in social life occurs, which is that people can actually persuade one another because by making good arguments, because they sort of already love one another, and they don't want to be in disagreement with one another. And final thing about this, and this is the point about what I call conversation, you have to listen as well as talk. Let people say what they think, and not jump in as soon as they say something you don't like and complain about it, but listen to the whole picture, try and understand what it is they're up to.
Hmm. Thank you. There's a question here which is specifically about COVID, but I think we could expand it, particularly in the aftermath of Brexit. The question is, there have been mass reverse migrations of people back to their home countries, and they may end up staying there for some time or even the rest of their lives. So how does this affect such people who otherwise might have considered themselves global citizens, and how might this impact on their understanding of their own identities?
Yes, I mean there's two kinds of people who are important here in thinking about people who are, as it were, forced by circumstance to move. Some of them are, you know, it's going to happen in Britain because of Brexit, but some of them are refugees. I mean, they're not. It's not an orderly process governed by law and the denial of visas. It's if you don't move, somebody will kill you or try to, or starve you or whatever. So there are these two unhappy kinds of migration going on, both of which I think should affect our thinking about global citizenship. When you so I've lived in the United States much longer than most of my students, twice as long as some of them, and my American students. But they grew up in America and I didn't. So even though I've lived in America longer than they have been alive, there's a sort of set of experiences that they had as children that I had elsewhere. I had in Ghana or in England. So that if you're someone who's been sent back, either because maybe you're young and you did grow up in the place you've been sent back to, but maybe you grew up in the place you've been sent back from. In either case, your particular kind of life memory or life experience, that your whole sense of who you are and how that relates to place, is obviously different from that of people who live settled lives, who grew up in the place like the little village in Oxfordshire that I showed you at the start, like Filkins. There's some people there who've been there a long time. I mean, not just them, but their parents and grandparents. Not many these days in a small village in Oxfordshire, but still some. So it gets complicated for such people, for people who have deep connections in more than one place, is I suppose the point. But I mean, that is the genius of cosmopolitanism. It says that we should all claim and recognize a human identity, but that we should all recognize that other people have other identities, and we should be open for conversation and exchange with people of other identities. So if you're someone who's lived in Britain for 50 years or something, and you've been kicked out and back in Jamaica, people ought to, the cosmopolitans in Jamaica will recognize that you have a different story from the ones of the people who live locally, but they'll be curious about it. They'll probably be angry on your behalf that you were forced to live in Jamaica, a place that Jamaicans live in voluntarily, but people kicked out don't live in voluntarily. And so I think sort of conversation across identities and differences is something that a cosmopolitan takes it for granted is valuable. And so when they move, they know that they're taking with them something, an element or a dimension of identity from one place, and they have, in virtue of that, something to offer to the cosmopolitan conversation in the new place or the old place, just as their interactions with the people with whom they haven't been living recently will give them valuable things as well. So I think, so that's one side of this. I should say, on the other hand, and this is particularly relevant to refugees, as global citizens, we do have a responsibility to make sure our politicians construct a world in which asylum works, and as far as possible, asylum isn't necessary. I mean,
mm,
asylum's only necessary because some states are doing terrible things.
mm,
Those states are part of a system of states. My government, your government, is involved through the United Nations with that state and
yes.
has things it can do to help that state not be the kind of state from which asylum is necessary. So that's another dimension of global citizenship, I think, is a sense of doing your fair share to exercise the responsibilities of a citizen, which in the global context means making your own state a good citizen of the system of states, and working hard to make it the case that when Myanmar abuses the Rohingya or the Syrians abuse people of other traditions, we do something about it. And in the meanwhile, we protect the people who are being abused. We don't let them drown in the Mediterranean, and we don't refuse, like the President of the United States, to offer asylum to a reasonable number of them, and so on. You should be against as a global citizen, you should be against your government doing that.
Absolutely. There's a question, it's not a follow-up question from the same person, but it's along a similar theme. It's about the COVID, Ebola, Spanish flu, the sort of flight away from something like that. Also the flight by the have-nots. Do you think this leads to a stronger sense of tribalism, or does it undermine tribalism, making this sort of global human community more united?
I think it can do both, and it is doing both. We can't solve COVID or refugees or climate on our own, where we means any particular country. China can't do it, biggest country in the world. The United States can't do it, the richest country in the world. Can't do it on our own. India can't do it, soon to have the largest population of the world. I mean, so, and in order to create the resources, the wealth to do it, we can't turn our back, I think, on global trade. We have to. So it's not a matter of choice whether we interact with one another. It's only a matter of on what terms. And the cosmopolitan terms are the terms for the contact hypothesis. They are rough equality and mutual respect and operating on productively on problems that matter to us all. We would have had no chance. Unfortunately, we blew it in the United States and the United Kingdom, but we wouldn't have had the chance we did have to delay and perhaps minimize the effects of COVID if we hadn't had the World Health Organization and if the Chinese hadn't genotyped the virus and made it available extremely quickly. I mean, not quickly enough, but pretty damn quickly. And if we'd responded as we should have, we could have saved, well, at least tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of lives. So that was a failure, not because of the failure of the global system. It was the failure of the local national systems to respond to what the world was giving, the global system was providing. So I think it would be crazy to conclude from this moment that we don't need one another, or that it's a good idea to close ourselves off permanently to one another. Obviously, travel in a medical emergency, you have to have quarantine regulations. But those quarantine regulations aren't designed, they shouldn't be designed, in my view, around particularly around national borders. They should be organized around rational borders to help stop the spread of the pandemic. And in the case of the United Kingdom, that means people shouldn't be traveling up and down to castles in Derbyshire.
Yes. No, I think this is absolutely resonates with everything that's going on in the UK. There's recent reports this week that had we locked down just 4 or 5 days earlier, we might have saved 20,000 lives. It is that stark that,
Yeah.
and these are
And the point
political
is,
decisions.
right, and this was, that difference, right, is something that any second year undergraduate epidemiologist could have told you. So it wasn't as
Yeah.
if nobody knew that time was of the essence. All the experts would have told them, I'm sure did tell them, that time was of the essence, precisely because of the way these curves work. So now, yeah, I mean, I don't think that the failure of response in the United States was mostly a matter of xenophobia or chauvinism. In our country, though there was an element of that in some of the bad decisions, the main thing, I'm not saying it was in England either, I'm just saying that a lot of bad motivation, a lot of motivations I think we could identify have nothing to do with the question we're talking about, the question of pluralism or cosmopolitanism. But though I do think that the decision of President Trump to cut off China quickly, but to delay cutting off Europe was probably somewhat chauvinistic. But that's not, I don't think that's the big story. The other things went wrong. But as I say, I just think it's wrong to conclude from this moment that we should stop. We need to do more together. When the virus is developed, it will only protect most of us if it protects most of us, if most people in the world have access to it. Otherwise, there'll just be reservoirs of the disease waiting to escape, and we can't shut off. Ghana permanently.
No, absolutely. There's a question here that brings us back to this issue of pluralism quite explicitly. They say, do you think pluralism comes when we have honest conversations about marginalization or difference, or just doing something where we all share a goal and don't really talk about those diverse identities? And then the follow-up, what does this mean for global diplomacy?
All right, let me, I think the connection with global diplomacy is not clear to me, but I guess my view is that the key cosmopolitan idea is that we manage pluralism both nationally and internationally by remaining in conversation with one another, which means, yes, talking about things that we don't disagree about, keeping in conversation all the time about just everything, having the Olympics and having World Soccer and having all these things which provide topics of transcultural conversation, having the World Council of Churches, but also the World Parliament of Religions, having those kinds of conversations where people are, in fact, in those contexts, mostly focused on the things they agree about. But that's not a good idea either. You should focus on just things that interest you both, and you'll find you have different attitudes to them, and you should get used to having different attitudes to things with people that you get along with, that you like. Then you have this resource when there is a point of conflict that you can try and draw on, which is the trust. That means that you can say, like Mr. Corral knows Maxi, and Mr. Maxi knows Mr. Corral. They can trust. They can, whatever Mr. Corral's. It's unfortunate that Anwar doesn't trust his father to get this right, but he does get it right, more or less spontaneously, and he gets it right because he basically, he loves the boy because the boy is his son's best friend. So I think, and that's because they're in conversation. So I think. And then they can bring up this thing they disagree about. And Mr. Corral, as I say, does the right thing. He says, look, I'm not going to tell you that I think it's okay, in the sense of, I'm not going to deny that my religion says that it's wrong, and I'm deeply committed to my religion. But I'm going to say that I love you nevertheless, and that I want you to come to the party. And we've prepared the food just for you. And now, as I say, that's theoretically a bit puzzling. But I think it's practically something that everybody knows how to do. And back to families again. In families, we know that there's an annoying uncle who has bizarre views about something, and we're used to him. And that doesn't mean we can't come to the Christmas party. It just means that, you know, we raise our eyebrows a little bit sometimes when he says things, and sometimes we tell him, you know, Joe, that's daft. So now, as far as so I think you don't want to not talk about things that matter to you where you disagree, but you don't want you want to decide which are the important ones. You don't want to bring up every tiny thing. Part of the difficulty, I understand why people talk about microaggressions, and they're real, but you have to decide whether to raise them. Because if you raise, precisely because they are micro, you raise them all the time, you're never going to have time for any of the good things in life, in conversation. So I think you've got to be not manipulative, but strategic. You've got to say, in this relationship, is it important enough an issue to raise? That's true in politics, in international politics. There are lots of irritations in the relationship. The President of the United States complained last week about European regulations about lobsters and suggested that he would ban European car imports until Europe changed its regulations. Well, this is a paradigm of daftness. It's a paradigm of not keeping things properly in perspective, and that's a political example. That's a diplomatic example. I have no idea whether he'll actually do what he says. He often says these things and then forgets about them, which is a very good thing. But if he did do it, it would be bad diplomacy for the same reason it would be bad to spend all your time with your annoying uncle, focusing on the fact that he's annoying. So you've got to, as it were, earn the trust to be able to raise the issues that matter. And that includes not raising issues that don't matter enough to be raised.
It's a very good point. You know, I've worked in the same Punjabi village in northern Punjab for more than 20 years. And I remember once getting a lot of aggression because I was explaining Christian theology and I referred to Jesus as the Son of God. And people got very agitated, very angry, and really, you know, shouted at me and demanded that I renounce this horrible idea. And yet every single year they put on a Christmas party for me. When I'm there at Christmas, which is, you know, sort of 1 out of 3 or 4 years, they bought a Christmas tree for me. They make a birthday cake to celebrate the birth of Jesus. And they don't seem to mind that, you know, we celebrate the birth of Jesus, which clearly must be important. I suppose it's an urs of some sort. But they get very angry if I try to explain some of the base tenets of Christianity. And so I follow this advice. Exactly. There are some conversations that we raise occasionally, but that's not where we dwell.
Right.
And I think that's crucial.
I mean, you know, whether, I mean, I assume that they now know that you think that the appropriate way to refer to Jesus is as the Son of God. So you've got that over, and they haven't asked you to renounce that. They've just asked you to shut up about it.
Yes.
You know, my growing up in Ghana, where in Kumasi, in my hometown, and I can't. It's a very particular place, and I don't know what it's like in other towns, and I'm not going to generalize about the whole country. But in the town that I grew up in, which is the second city of the country, the overall organization for doing charitable work was organized around churches and mosques, and Muslims and Christians, Catholics, Baptists, Methodists, Pentecostalists, and so on, and Druze actually work together. Now, and so, for example, throughout my childhood, we went at Eid to my Muslim cousins to eat. the very excellent Lebanese style food that my Ghanaian aunt, married to a Lebanese man, made. I'm ashamed to say that I hadn't the vaguest idea really about what was going on in Ramadan until I was grown up. And these cousins, they were mostly female, so my female cousins, girls, they came to us for Christmas, and sometimes they came to our church at Christmas. So they knew a good deal more, as it happens, about what Christians thought about things than, and their mother was Christian too, so that probably helped. So you can have that kind of close cohabitation and love and respect without knowing very much about other people's deep views about anything. That's it's a feature of families, but it's a feature of society. So a lot of people in England couldn't tell you two things about Judaism.
Sure.
Or how many people in England can explain the origins of the distinction between Sunni and Shia Islam?
Yeah.
So, or the doctrine of the Trinity, for that matter. These are things that matter a lot to certain of our fellow citizens, and we don't necessarily know very much about them. And maybe it's a good thing. Certainly, we wouldn't want to talk about them all the time, because then we'd be focusing on something that it turns out we disagree about. Though we'll discover that we, as the World Parliament of Religions has, that there are ways of framing our disagreements that make them look less serious, and other ways that are more contentious and aggressive and lead to conflict. So, but I think it's an interesting fact that people can that one way people handle religious difference is by treating it as a source of identity for their fellow citizens who are of other religions, but not really being interested in the ideas that go with that religious tradition, and not talking about it much. Now, in Kumasi, as it happens, and sorry, I didn't make the point I wanted to make about Kumasi is, however, what was true in Kumasi was, if you said to someone, explain to me what you people think about something or other, they would. They wouldn't say, none of your business, or you should become a Muslim first, or you should become a Christian first. They would just tell you. And then if you disagreed with them, they would say, oh, well, we don't agree about that. And then, you would go your merry way, and you'd meet the next time. So, and there are moments in societies where that can't happen, where because religious identity has become a salient source of conflict, people won't talk to each other about the content of their religious beliefs. Now, I'm a big believer in recognizing the importance in religious life of things other than theology. I think praxis, what people do in virtue of their religious identities, is at least as important as what they think. But thinking matters to most people with most religions. They do have some doxastic commitments, and I myself, I'm interested in them, even though obviously you can't agree with everybody. You can't agree with more than one of them, probably. But I'm interested in the views of all of them. And for me, it's fun to talk to people about these things. And I'm happy to tell them what I think, and I'm happy to hear what they think. I'm happy to make arguments with them if they're willing to listen to arguments. And of course, I'm certainly willing to listen to arguments myself.
Yes, you said that earlier. I think that's actually a very important part of the message, is the persuading must come along with being willing to be persuaded and being open to persuasion.
Yeah. I mean, I've changed my mind about lots of things over the years that I wouldn't have predicted I'd change my mind about. Even if it's not not 180 degrees, but, important things.
Okay. We have a question here, picking up on something you mentioned about multinational corporations mobilizing tribalism on a global scale. And the question is, how does the idea of cosmopolitanism work to promote equality and cooperation?
Well, for me, the central idea, as I said, is conversation across identities on terms of rough equality and mutual respect. So if you aren't having a conversation with people which sort of presupposes their fundamental equality with you, it's not, in my view, the right kind of
conversation. But I suspect your questioner is interested in a more specific kind of question about inequality, which is a question about economic inequality in particular, not just about mutual respect and so on, because it's clearly genuinely possible to respect someone who's much, much poorer than you, as it's clearly genuinely possible to respect someone who's much, much richer than you. And that leaves you both where you were as far as the riches go. So I think at a minimum, because the ethical core of cosmopolitanism is that thought that everybody matters, you can't be a cosmopolitan unless you think that everybody must have the resources for a decent human life. And since the world contains between 1 and 2 billion, depending on how you measure these things, people who don't, as a cosmopolitan, you can't be happy with the global distribution of wealth and income. And since the fundamental moral thought is that you must do your fair share, you must do your fair share to secure, to contribute to securing for everybody that basic set of rights and resources that are needed for a decent human life. That's just, if you don't believe that, I don't think you're what I would call a cosmopolitan. You don't have to think that everybody has to have the same amount of stuff. You might think that as long as everybody's got enough, it doesn't matter that some people have more. What matters is that some people don't have enough. It doesn't matter what people above the baseline have. Though, of course, you know, there can be injustice in the distribution of goods above the baseline, and you should worry about that too, because again, if everybody matters, it matters that everybody lives in a world of justice. But I think a cosmopolitan will expect that notions of justice will differ, that they will be in conversation with people who have different ideas from them about what's fair, especially above the baseline, and that's not going to go away. I mean, one of the great insights that led to John Rawls's book, A Theory of Justice, which really re-energized modern moral thinking in the English-speaking world in the 1970s, was the recognition that we had to figure out ways to live in a world in which there were people with many different conceptions of the good life, different conceptions of what it is to live well, different, what he called comprehensive views about ethics, about the meaning of life, and the goodness, what's good in life, and what matters in life. Even if you're an objectivist about that question, even if you think that there is a correct answer to that question, you have to live in a world where there isn't agreement about what the correct answer is. And that means that every moral position has to have something to say about how it deals with people who have different views from them about how to live a good life, what it is to live a good life. Liberalism is one pattern of politics that aims to allow people who have different conceptions of the good to live together side by side. It's not the only pattern, but it is a pattern. And pluralism developed in other ways as well. It developed in a different way in the Ottoman Empire and in Holland in the 17th and 18th century. But modern liberalism takes it that the state, again, just as the state is not on the side of one tribe, it's not on the side of one comprehensive conception of the good. It's not on the side of one religion. It's not on the side of one philosophy. It wants to allow people of different reasonable religious views to pursue their religious views side by side and in conversation with one another, because we have to be in conversation to run either a country or the world.
Okay. There's a question here specifically about gender identities. And I think given the example you gave from skins, also the sort of sexual orientation identities, the question is, what changes have gender identities made in a global context? And I think within our lifetimes, probably, I don't know about you, but I certainly did not expect to see the level of acceptance and recognition of, for example, same-sex rights and the LGBTQ community. Certainly, if you'd asked me when I was 20 years old will any of this happen in your lifetime? I'd have said never.
Right.
So it's, you know, it's a very
Me too.
welcome, rapid change. But given those changes, and in, you know, the adoption of non-binary genders and transgenders, what are the implications for this wider global context, and in particular, what is the perspective of the family? How does this impact on the family?
Well, yeah, probably, I mean, it's very hard to measure these things, but probably 95% of people in the world today are cisgendered men or cisgendered women, and also if at least somewhat interested in sexual relations with people of the other sex. That's the main way families come into being, because cisgendered men and cisgendered heterosexual men and women get together and make babies. And it's natural, therefore, that that's the central pattern, and it's going to be most of the cases. There are, as we know, many, many different ways of organizing family life, even for cisgendered heterosexual people. Just to mention one obvious one, well, perhaps not obvious, but obvious to me. I grew up in Kumasi. In Kumasi, the main cultural group, the Asante, are matrilineal, so you belong to your mother's family. But my mother grew up in Philippines, and in there, you belong to your father's family. That's a significant difference. It means that I have a bigger role in the lives of my sister's children than I would if I'd been, 100% grown up in a patrilineal society. So, the main effect on family life of these changes is that people are growing up in families, in these heterosexual families, are growing up in families, some of which are ready for them not to be cisgendered heterosexual people, and prepared to handle that and love them and get on with it, as it were, and not to make a mess of it. But it also has other consequences. It means that there are now increasingly, we have gay marriage in our two countries. That there are now gay couples, and they have children in various ways, by surrogacy, or if they're women, by sperm donation, and so on. And those families are also, the children in those families are going to go to schools, and again, the other children have to be ready to live alongside people who have two mothers or two fathers, or, as well as, of course, as just one father or one mother, which is also a pattern, I mean, a possibility. So I think that's the main effect on the family, is that you have to be a little bit prepared that that your family will be entered by a child who turns out to be trans or gay or bisexual or something, or asexual, which is a thing that people don't talk about much, and is very difficult, I think, to be someone who, to say to someone. It's quite difficult to come out as asexual in our society now. It's possible. It's much easier to say you're gay than to say, look, actually, I don't get sex. And we don't know how many people there are, because, as I say, these things are hard to count. But there are a lot of people apparently like that. So so you have to be prepared as a parent, and as a grandparent, and as an uncle and an aunt, and a brother and a sister for this possibility. That's the main family effect, I think. Yes, I mean, you said that you were surprised at the rate at which it happened. I certainly was too. Perhaps more in the United States than anywhere, because of the because in my experience, when I came to the United States in the late 70s for the first time, the United States was much more homophobic than Britain, at least at the level in the in the part of society that I was in. I was going from Cambridge, England, to New Haven, Massachusetts, Connecticut, to Yale, and the homophobia wasn't a huge thing at Yale, but at Cambridge it really wasn't much of a thing at all. So so I wasn't expecting it, and I think we have to see these things as connected. I think the part of why, for example, gay marriage, I think, has been recognized relatively swiftly in terms of these historic transitions, is because of the success of the anti-patriarchal element of the feminist movement. Because from the point of view, this is a place in which societies differ. You'll know this better than I will, because you know something about India. In Western Europe and North America, hostility to homosexuality is largely about people doing something that's gender inappropriate, namely having sex with someone of their own gender. So it's inappropriate for a man to have sex with a man. It's inappropriate for a woman to have sex with a woman. So that's part of the package of gender. If you loosen up the gender norms, then as well, that goes with it. You can say, well, if a man wants to do that, let him. I suspect that in India, first of all, they have a long tradition of recognizing hijras and trans people who would fall in the trans family for us. But second, I suspect the main worry about particularly male homosexuality is that you won't have children. It's not really about what you do. People don't, mostly not very interested. Sensible people aren't very interested in what other people do in their bedrooms. It's that you're not going to have children, and that matters to your family. But because not having children, again, partly as a result of feminism, has come to be one of the serious options for heterosexual couples, it's not so bad to accept. And then you get gay marriage, and now homosexual couples can have children, so it turns out you can have children, grandchildren, as it were. So I think the anxieties may be slightly different in different places. But in the end, my way of thinking about this is what's happened is we had a gender system that wasn't working very well for a lot of people. It wasn't working well for at least half the population, possibly more. We made big progress in the first part of my life on the gender front, on the women front, trying to reshape our gender systems in different ways around the world to make them more comfortable for women. This makes some men uncomfortable because they liked some of the advantages that they got from the old system that was making women uncomfortable. So it takes a little bit of a while to change. But now once you're on that path, you can see that our gender system was also making life uncomfortable for gay and trans people. And it turns out that mostly, despite the fact that there is this small number of men who I think feel that they've lost something, mostly the liberation of women has been good for everybody, men and women, and mostly the liberation of trans and LGBTQ people has been good for everybody, including cis straight people. So because, for example, they have children who are gay or trans, or they have friends or co-workers, and figuring out how to live happily in a society where there are people like that is part of figuring out how to live a happy life.
Thank you. We have now run out of time. I would like to thank you very much. There are more people asking questions, but I'm afraid they'll have to wait for your next public event. I would like to give you just the final word, Professor Appiah. Right now, your city, London less so, but your city across the United States, there are mass protests. Everything you said tonight seems to me actually to speak directly to what's going on. And I know that you've been engaged in these conversations for decades now. Could you, in a very brief moment, give us a kind of insight into what's happening in the United States and where we go? Where will the Black Lives Matter movement? Where will these protests? Will they result in what we want? That's really what I want to hear.
I don't know. But I'm more hopeful than I've been in a very long time about this, because there are two really interesting things about these protests, I think. One is that they have occurred at some risk. People were, I mean, fortunately, most of the protesters have been wearing masks. And fortunately, we have pretty good evidence now that open air isn't a good place to contract the disease. So if you keep away, if you don't breathe over each other, and if you wear masks, actually these demonstrations aren't as dangerous as you might think. But still, people have been relatively responsible about that. But still, they knew they were taking risks and they took it anyway. So that's one thing. In other words, it's a sign of the seriousness. The second thing is they are really multiracial and also involve young and old people and so on. And particularly younger people, younger white, particularly college-educated Americans, are really exercised about racial injustice. And they were before this particular set of episodes, but it's sort of in their bones now. So they've been waiting for a moment to make something important happen. I think it's part of what's going on, I think, is that because the president has handled this so fantastically badly, it's also generated an anti-establishment component, not just against bad policing, but just against the president, which is also another thing that's bringing people out. Is just a sense, look, he's not saying the right things about this. We want to make sure the right things get said. And the way we do that is we all go out together and we say Black Lives Matter. He won't utter those words. And he'll say idiotic things about police brutality. And he has in fact encouraged it in the past. So I think that also, and finally I'd say, so I'm moderately optimistic, and let me say that, look, I did a calculation the other day. An African-American man is 100 times more likely to be shot in this country than anybody in Britain is likely to be ever by the police, 100 times. But a white young man is 25 times more likely to be shot in this country than in the United Kingdom. Very often in the United States, the problems there are kind of most sharply visible in the African-American community, but they're actually American problems. The COVID-19 thing has revealed massive problems in our healthcare system. African-Americans have borne the brunt of it. They've suffered at a higher rate than other people. But the problems are everybody's problems. And we are a society whose policing is out of control. Black people, 50% of African Americans in a poll a couple of years ago, done by extremely respectable polling organization, the National NRC, which is one of the leading polling organizations, so I believe it, found that half of the African Americans they contacted had had a bad interaction with the police. Half. The percentage for white people was 3%. Well, I think what's interesting is that, you know, that's been true all along. It's been true all the time I've been here, and at least since Black Lives Matter, it's been clear to a lot of people, and it was clear to African Americans all along. But I do think there's been this huge shift. So among the people who walked to the White House this week, was a Republican senator in a Black Lives Matter march. That's pretty amazing to me. He was the only one, but there he was in his mask. And I would say, now I think part of the explanation for that is that he's a Mormon, and there's a kind of deep decency in Mormonism, which I respect. But nevertheless, he's also, you know, a Republican, and even the Republican Party is planning to produce proposals for changes in the law. Inadequate, in my view, the ones they proposed so far. Much better the Democrat proposals, but still. And the fact that there are serious elected officials proposing not just to defund the police, but in some places to close police departments, shows how upset and angry people are about what's going on.
Mm.
Now, no sane person thinks we can run a modern society with no police. But the city of Camden, which is not too far from where I'm sitting now, it's a suburb of Philadelphia, but it's in New Jersey, did abolish its police service and asked the county it was in to take over police services. And when this protest started in Camden, the police joined the protest.
Mm.
So I think there's hope.
Thank
and
you.
the police chief was in the march.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. It's always nice to start to end on a hopeful note.
Yeah.
Professor Kwame Anthony Appiah, thank you very much on behalf of AKU, AKTC, AKM, and AKMI. We're extremely grateful for your time and your wisdom.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, sir.
Thank you for inviting me.